Chapter 7. How Abram our forefather went out of the land of the Chaldeans, and lived in the land then called Canaan, but now Judea.
1. Now Abram, having no son of his own, adopted Lot, his brother Haran's son, and his wife Sarai's brother, and he left the land of Chaldea, when he was 75 years old, and at the command of God went into Canaan, and therein he dwelt himself, and left it to his posterity.
He was a person of great sagacity, both for understanding all things, and persuading his hearers, and not mistaken in his opinions. For which reason he began to have higher notions of virtue than others had, and he determined to renew and to change the opinion all men happened then to have concerning God. For he was the first that ventured to publish this notion, that there was but one God, the Creator of the universe, and that as to other gods, if they contributed anything to the happiness of men, that each of them afforded it only according to his appointment, and not by their own power.
This his opinion was derived from the irregular phenomena that were visible both at land and sea, as well as those that happened to the sun, and moon, and all the heavenly bodies. Thus, if, said he, these bodies had power of their own, they would certainly take care of their own regular motions. But since they do not preserve such regularity, they make it plain that in so far as they cooperate to our advantage, they do it not of their own abilities, but as they are subservient to him that commands them, to whom alone we ought justly to offer our honor and thanksgiving. For which doctrines when the Chaldeans and other people of Mesopotamia raised a tumult against him, he thought fit to leave that country, and at the command, and by the assistance of God, he came and lived in the land of Canaan.
And when he was there settled, he built an altar, and performed a sacrifice to God.
2. Berosus mentions our father Abram without naming him, when he says thus, in the 10th generation after the flood, there was among the Chaldeans a man, righteous, and great, and skillful in the celestial science.
But Hecataeus does more than barely mention him, for he composed, and left behind him, a book concerning him.
And Nicolaus of Damascus, in the 4th book of his history says thus, Abram reigned at Damascus, being a foreigner, who came with an army out of the land above Babylon, called the land of the Chaldeans. But after a long time he got him up, and removed from that country also, with his people, and went into the land then called the land of Canaan, but now the land of Judea. And this when his posterity were become a multitude, as to which posterity of his we relate their history in another work. Now the name of Abram is even still famous in the country of Damascus, and there is showed a village named from him, the habitation of Abram. Chapter 8. That when there was a famine in Canaan, Abram went thence into Egypt, and after he had continued there a while, he returned back again. 1. Now after this, when a famine had invaded the land of Canaan, and Abram had discovered that the Egyptians were in a flourishing condition, he was disposed to go down to them, both to partake of the plenty they enjoyed, and to become an auditor of their priests, and to know what they said concerning the gods, designing either to follow them, if they had better notions than he, or to convert them into a better way, if his own notions proved the truest.
Now seeing he was to take Sarai with him, and was afraid of the madness of the Egyptians with regard to women, lest the king should kill him on occasion of his wife's great beauty, he contrived this device. He pretended to be her brother, and directed her in a dissembling way to pretend the same, for he said, it would be for their benefit. Now as soon as they came into Egypt, it happened to Abram as he supposed it would.
For the fame of his wife's beauty was greatly talked of, for which reason Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, would not be satisfied with what was reported of her, but would needs see her himself, and was preparing to enjoy her.
But God put a stop to his unjust inclinations, by sending upon him a distemper, and a sedition against his government.
And when he inquired of the priests, how he might be freed from these calamities, they told him, that his miserable condition was derived from the wrath of God, upon account of his inclinations to abuse the stranger's wife.
He then, out of fear, asked Sarai who she was, and who it was that she brought along with her. And when he had found out the truth, he excused himself to Abram, that supposing the woman to be his sister, and not his wife, he set his affections on her, as desiring an affinity with him by marrying her, but not as incited by lust to abuse her.
He also made him a large present in money, and gave him leave to enter into conversation with the most learned among the Egyptians.
From which conversation, his virtue and his reputation became more conspicuous than they had been before.
2. For whereas the Egyptians were formerly addicted to different customs, and despised one another's sacred and accustomed rites, and were very angry one with another on that account, Abram conferred with each of them, and confuting the reasonings they made use of, every one for their own practices, he demonstrated that such reasonings were vain, and void of truth. Whereupon he was admired by them, in those conferences, as a very wise man, and one of great sagacity, when he discoursed on any subject he undertook. And this not only in understanding it, but in persuading other men also to assent to him.
He communicated to them arithmetic, and delivered to them the science of astronomy.
For before Abram came into Egypt they were unacquainted with those parts of learning. For that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt, and from thence to the Greeks also. 3. As soon as Abram was come back into Canaan, he parted the land between him and Lot, upon account of the tumultuous behavior of their shepherds, concerning the pastures wherein they should feed their flocks. However, he gave Lot his option, or leave to choose which lands he would take, and he took, himself, what the other left, which were the lower grounds at the foot of the mountains, and he himself dwelt in Hebron, which is a city 7 years ancienter than Tanis of Egypt.
But Lot possessed the land of the plain, and the river Jordan, not far from the city of Sodom, which was then a fine city, but is now destroyed, by the will and wrath of God, the cause of which I shall show in its proper place hereafter. Chapter
9. The destruction of the Sodomites by the Assyrian war. 1. At this time, when the Assyrians had the dominion over Asia, the people of Sodom were in a flourishing condition, both as to riches and the number of their youth.
There were 5 kings that managed the affairs of this country, Balas, Barsas, Sennabar, and Sumobor, with the king of Bela, and each king led on his own troops.
And the Assyrians made war upon them, and dividing their army into 4 parts, fought against them. Now every part of the army had its own commander, and when the battle was joined, the Assyrians were conquerors, and imposed a tribute upon the kings of the Sodomites, who submitted to this slavery 12 years, and so long they continued to pay their tribute. But on the 13th year they rebelled, and then the army of the Assyrians came upon them, under their commanders, Amraphel, Arioch, Chedorlaomer, and Tidal.
These kings had laid waste all Syria, and overthrown the offspring of the giants.
And when they were come over against Sodom, they pitched their camp at the vale called the Slime Pits. For at that time there were pits in that place. But now, upon the destruction of the city of Sodom, that vale became the lake Asphaltites, as it is called. However, concerning this lake, we shall speak more presently. Now when the Sodomites joined battle with the Assyrians, and the fight was very obstinate, many of them were killed, and the rest were carried captive, among which captives was Lot, who had come to assist the Sodomites.
Chapter
10. How Abram fought with the Assyrians, and overcame them, and saved the Sodomite prisoners, and took from the Assyrians the prey they had gotten.
1. When Abram heard of their calamity, he was at once afraid for Lot, his kinsman, and pitied the Sodomites, his friends and neighbors, and thinking it proper to afford them assistance, he did not delay it, but marched hastily, and the 5th night fell upon the Assyrians, near Dan, for that is the name of the other spring of Jordan. And before they could arm themselves he slew some as they were in their beds, before they could suspect any harm, and others, who were not yet gone to sleep, but were so drunk they could not fight, ran away.
Abram pursued after them till, on the 2nd day, he drove them in a body unto Hobah, a place belonging to Damascus, and thereby demonstrated that victory does not depend on multitude, and the number of hands, but the alacrity and courage of soldiers overcome the most numerous bodies of men, while he got the victory over so great an army with no more than 318 of his servants, and 3 of his friends.
But all those that fled returned home ingloriously.
2. So Abram, when he had saved the captive Sodomites, who had been taken by the Assyrians, and Lot also, his kinsman, returned home in peace. Now the king of Sodom met him at a certain place, which they called the King's Dale, where Melchizedek, king of the city Salem, received him. That name signifies, the righteous king, and such he was without dispute, insomuch that, on this account, he was made the priest of God.
However, they afterward called Salem Jerusalem.
Now this Melchizedek supplied Abram's army in an hospitable manner, and gave them provisions in abundance. And as they were feasting, he began to praise him, and to bless God for subduing his enemies under him.
And when Abram gave him the 10th part of his prey, he accepted of the gift.
But the king of Sodom desired Abram to take the prey, but entreated that he might have those men restored to him whom Abram had saved from the Assyrians, because they belonged to him. But Abram would not do so, nor would make any other advantage of that prey, than what his servants had eaten, but still insisted that he should afford a part to his friends that had assisted him in the battle. The first of them was called Eskel, and then Ener, and Mambre. 3. And God commended his virtue, and said, Thou shalt not however lose the rewards thou hast deserved to receive by such thy glorious actions. He answered, And what advantage will it be to me to have such rewards, when I have none to enjoy them after me? For he was hitherto childless. And God promised, that he should have a son, and that his posterity should be very numerous, insomuch, that their number should be like the stars.
When he heard that, he offered a sacrifice to God, as he commanded him. The manner of the sacrifice was this. He took an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram in like manner of 3 years old, and a turtle-dove, and a pigeon. And, as he was enjoined, he divided the 3 former, but the birds he did not divide.
After which, before he built his altar, where the birds of prey flew about as desirous of blood, a divine voice came to him, declaring that their neighbors would be grievous to his posterity, when they should be in Egypt, for 400 years. During which time they should be afflicted, but afterwards should overcome their enemies, should conquer the Canaanites in war, and possess themselves of their land and of their cities. 4. Now Abram dwelt near the oak called Ogages. The place belongs to Canaan, not far from the city of Hebron.
But being uneasy at his wife's barrenness, he entreated God to grant that he might have male issue, and God required of him to be of good courage, and said, that he would add to all the rest of the benefits that he had bestowed upon him, ever since he led him out of Mesopotamia, the gift of children.
Accordingly Sarai, at God's command, brought to his bed one of her handmaidens, a woman of Egyptian descent, in order to obtain children by her. And when this handmaid was with child, she triumphed, and ventured to affront Sarai, as if the dominion were to come to a son to be born of her.
But when Abram resigned her into the hands of Sarai, to punish her, she contrived to fly away, as not able to bear the instances of Sarai's severity to her, and she entreated God to have compassion on her. Now a divine angel met her, as she was going forward in the wilderness, and bid her return to her master and mistress, for if she would submit to that wise advice, she should live better hereafter. For that the reason of her being in such a miserable case was this, that she had been ungrateful and arrogant towards her mistress. He also told her, that if she disobeyed God, and went on still in her way, she should perish, but if she would return back, she should become the mother of a son, who should reign over that country. These admonitions she obeyed, and returned to her master and mistress, and obtained forgiveness. A little while afterwards, she bare Ismael, which may be interpreted heard of God, because God had heard his mother's prayer. 5. The forementioned son was born to Abram when he was 86 years old.
But when he was 99, God appeared to him, and promised him, that he should have a son by Sarai, and commanded that his name should be Isaac, and showed him that from this son should spring great nations and kings, and that they should obtain all the land of Canaan by war, from Sidon to Egypt. But he charged him, in order to keep his posterity unmixed with others, that they should be circumcised in the flesh of their foreskin, and that this should be done on the 8th day after they were born. The reason of which circumcision I will explain in another place.
And Abram inquiring also concerning Ismael, whether he should live or not, God signified to him, that he should live to be very old, and should be the father of great nations.
Abram therefore gave thanks to God for these blessings, and then he, and all his family, and his son Ismael were circumcised immediately, the son being that day 13 years of age, and he 99. Chapter 11. How God overthrew the nation of the Sodomites, out of his wrath against them for their sins. 1. About this time the Sodomites grew proud, on account of their riches and great wealth. They became unjust towards men, and impious towards God, insomuch that they did not call to mind the advantages they received from him. They hated strangers, and abused themselves with sodomitical practices. God was therefore much displeased at them, and determined to punish them for their pride, and to overthrow their city, and to lay waste their country, till there should neither plant nor fruit grow out of it. 2. When God had thus resolved concerning the Sodomites, Abraham, as he sat by the oak of Mamre, at the door of his tent, saw 3 angels, and thinking them to be strangers, he rose up, and saluted them, and desired they would accept of an entertainment, and abide with him. To which, when they agreed, he ordered cakes of meal to be made presently. And when he had slain a calf, he roasted it, and brought it to them, as they sat under the oak. Now they made a show of eating, and besides they asked him about his wife Sarah, where she was. And when he said, she was within, they said they should come again hereafter, and find her become a mother. Upon which the woman laughed, and said that it was impossible she should bear children, since she was 90 years of age, and her husband was 100. Then they concealed themselves no longer, but declared that they were angels of God, and that one of them was sent to inform them about the child, and 2 for the overthrow of Sodom. 3. When Abraham heard this, he was grieved for the Sodomites, and he rose up, and besought God for them, and entreated him that he would not destroy the righteous with the wicked. And when God had replied, that there was no good man among the Sodomites, for if there were but 10 such men among them, he would not punish any of them for their sins, Abraham held his peace. And the angels came to the city of the Sodomites, and Lot entreated them to accept of a lodging with him. For he was a very generous and hospitable man, and one that had learned to imitate the goodness of Abraham. Now when the Sodomites saw the young men to be of beautiful countenances, and this to an extraordinary degree, and that they took up their lodgings with Lot, they resolved themselves to enjoy these beautiful boys by force and violence. And when Lot exhorted them to sobriety, and not to offer anything immodest to the strangers, but to have regard to their lodging in his house, and promised, that if their inclinations could not be governed, he would expose his daughters to their lust, instead of these strangers. Neither thus were they made ashamed. 4. But God was much displeased at their impudent behavior, so that he both smote those men with blindness, and condemned the Sodomites to universal destruction.
But Lot, upon God's informing him of the future destruction of the Sodomites, went away, taking with him his wife and daughters, who were 2, and still virgins. For those that were betrothed to them were above the thoughts of going, and deemed that Lot's words were trifling.
God then cast a thunderbolt upon the city, and set it on fire, with its inhabitants, and laid waste the country with the like burning. As I formerly said when I wrote the Jewish War.
But Lot's wife continually turning back to view the city, as she went from it, and being too nicely inquisitive what would become of it, although God had forbidden her so to do, was changed into a pillar of salt. For I have seen it, and it remains at this day. Now he and his daughters fled to a certain small place, encompassed with the fire, and settled in it. It is to this day called Zor, for that is the word which the Hebrews use for a small thing.
There it was that he lived a miserable life, on account of his having no company, and his want of provisions.
5. But his daughters, thinking that all mankind were destroyed, approached to their father, though taking care not to be perceived. This they did, that humankind might not utterly fail. And they bare sons. The son of the elder was named Moab, which denotes one derived from his father. The younger bare Ammon, which name denotes one derived from a kinsman. The former of whom was the father of the Moabites, which is even still a great nation. The latter was the father of the Ammonites, and both of them are inhabitants of Sele, Syria. And such was the departure of Lot from among the Sodomites. Chapter 12. Concerning Abimelech, and concerning Ismael the son of Abraham, and concerning the Arabians, which were his posterity.
1. Abraham now removed to Gerar of Palestine, leading Sarah along with him, under the notion of his sister, using the like dissimulation that he had used before, and this out of fear.
For he was afraid of Abimelech, the king of that country, who did also himself fall in love with Sarah, and was disposed to corrupt her. But he was restrained from satisfying his lust by a dangerous distemper, which befell him from God.
Now when his physicians despaired of curing him, he fell asleep, and saw a dream, warning him not to abuse the stranger's wife. And when he recovered he told his friends, that God had inflicted that disease upon him, by way of punishment for his injury to the stranger, and in order to preserve the chastity of his wife. For that she did not accompany him as his sister, but as his legitimate wife. And that God had promised to be gracious to him for the time to come, if this person be once secure of his wife's chastity.
When he had said this, by the advice of his friends he sent for Abraham, and bid him not to be in the least concerned about his wife, or fear the corruption of her chastity. For that God took care of him, and that it was by his providence that he received his wife again, without her suffering any abuse. And he appealed to God, and to his wife's conscience, and said that he had not any inclination at first to enjoy her, if he had known she was thy wife.
But since, said he, thou ledst her about as thy sister, I was guilty of no offense.
He also entreated him to be at peace with him, and to make God propitious to him. And that if he thought fit to continue with him, he should have what he wanted in abundance, but that if he designed to go away, he should be honorably conducted, and have whatsoever supply he wanted when he came thither. Upon his saying this, Abraham told him, that his pretense of kindred to his wife was no lie, because she was his brother's daughter, and that he did not think himself safe in his travels abroad without this sort of dissimulation. And that he was not the cause of his distemper, but was only solicitous for his own safety.
He said also that he was ready to stay with him,
Whereupon Abimelech assigned him land, and money, and they covenanted to live together without guile, and took an oath at a certain well, called Beersheba, which may be interpreted, the well of the oath. And so it is named by the people of the country unto this day. 2. Now in a little time Abraham had a son by Sarah, as God had foretold him, whom he named Isaac, which signifies laughter. And indeed they so called him, because Sarah laughed when God said that she should bear a son, she not expecting such a thing, as being past the age of childbearing. For she was 90 years old, and Abraham 100, so that this son was born to them both in the last year of each of those decimal numbers. And they circumcised him upon the 8th day. And from that time the Jews continue the custom of circumcising their sons within that number of days.
But as for the Arabians, they circumcise after the 13th year, because Ismael, the founder of their nation, who was born to Abraham of the concubine, was circumcised at that age, concerning whom I will presently give a particular account, with great exactness.
3. As for Sarah, she at first loved Ismael, who was born of her own handmaid Hagar, with an affection not inferior to that to a son of her own, for he was brought up in order to succeed in the government. But when she herself had borne Isaac, she was not willing that Ismael should be brought up with him, as being too old for him, and able to do him injuries when their father should be dead. She therefore persuaded Abraham to send him and his mother to some distant country. Now at the first he did not agree to what Sarah was so zealous for, and thought it an instance of the greatest barbarity to send away a young child, and a woman unprovided of necessaries. But at length he agreed to it, because God was pleased with what Sarah had determined. So he delivered Ismael to his mother, as not yet able to go by himself, and commanded her to take a bottle of water, and a loaf of bread, and so to depart, and to take necessity for her guide. But as soon as her necessary provisions failed, she found herself in an evil case, and when the water was almost spent, she laid the young child, who was ready to expire, under a fir tree, and went on farther, that so he might die while she was absent.
But a divine angel came to her, and told her of a fountain hard by, and bid her take care, and bring up the child, because she should be very happy by the preservation of Ishmael.
She then took courage, upon the prospect of what was promised her, and meeting with some shepherds, by their care she got clear of the distresses she had been in. 4. When the lad was grown up, he married a wife, by birth an Egyptian, from whence the mother was herself derived originally. Of this wife were born to Ishmael 12 sons, Nabaioth, Kedar, Abdeel, Mabsam, Adumas, Masmaus, Masaus, Chodad, the Man, Jetor, Naphasis, Cadmus. These inhabited all the country from Euphrates to the Red Sea, and called it Nabatean.
They are an Arabian nation, and named their tribes from these, both because of their own virtue, and because of the dignity of Abraham their father.
Chapter 13. Concerning Isaac, the legitimate son of Abraham. 1. Now Abraham greatly loved Isaac, as being his only begotten, and given to him at the borders of old age, by the favor of God.
The child also endeared himself to his parents still more, by the exercise of every virtue, and adhering to his duty to his parents, and being zealous in the worship of God. Abraham also placed his own happiness wholly in this prospect, that when he should die he should leave this his son in a safe and secure condition.
Which accordingly he obtained, by the will of God, who being desirous to make an experiment of Abraham's religious disposition towards himself, appeared to him, and enumerated all the blessings he had bestowed on him, how he had made him superior to his enemies, and that his son Isaac, who was the principal part of his present happiness, was derived from him, and he said that he required this son of his, as a sacrifice and holy oblation.
Accordingly he commanded him to carry him to the mountain Moriah, and to build an altar, and offer him for a burnt offering upon it. For that this would best manifest his religious disposition towards him, if he preferred what was pleasing to God, before the preservation of his own son.
2. Now Abraham thought that it was not right to disobey God in anything, but that he was obliged to serve him in every circumstance of life, since all creatures that live enjoy their life by his providence, and the kindness he bestows on them.
Accordingly he concealed this command of God, and his own intentions about the slaughter of his son, from his wife, as also from every one of his servants. Otherwise he should have been hindered from his obedience to God. And he took Isaac, together with 2 of his servants, and laying what things were necessary for a sacrifice upon an ass, he went away to the mountain.
Now the 2 servants went along with him 2 days, but on the 3rd day, as soon as he saw the mountain, he left those servants, that were with him till then, in the plain, and having his son alone with him, he came to the mountain. It was that mountain upon which King David afterwards built the temple. Now they had brought with them everything necessary for a sacrifice, excepting the animal that was to be offered only. Now Isaac was 25 years old, and as he was building the altar, he asked his father what he was about to offer. Since there was no animal there for an oblation?
To which it was answered, that God would provide himself an oblation, he being able to make a plentiful provision for men out of what they have not, and to deprive others of what they already have, when they put too much trust therein. That therefore if God pleased to be present and propitious at this sacrifice, he would provide himself of an oblation. 3. As soon as the altar was prepared, and Abraham had laid on the wood, and all things were entirely ready, he said to his son, O son, I poured out a vast number of prayers that I might have thee for my son. When thou wast come into the world, there was nothing that could contribute to thy support, for which I was not greatly solicitous, nor anything wherein I thought myself happier than to see thee grown up to man's estate, and that I might leave thee, at my death, the successor to my dominion. But since it was by God's will that I became thy father, and it is now his will that I relinquish thee, bear this consecration to God with a generous mind. For I resign thee up to God, who has thought fit now to require this testimony of honor to himself, on account of the favors he hath conferred on me, in being to me a supporter and defender. Accordingly thou, my son, wilt now die, not in any common way of going out of the world, but sent to God, the Father of all men, beforehand, by thy own father, in the nature of a sacrifice. I suppose he thinks thee worthy to get clear of this world, neither by a disease, neither by war, nor by any other severe ways, by which death usually comes upon men, but so that he will receive thy soul with prayers and holy offices of religion, and will place thee near to himself, and thou wilt there be to me a succorer and supporter in my old age, on which account I principally brought thee up, and thou wilt thereby procure me God for my comforter instead of thyself. 4. Now Isaac was of such a generous disposition, as became the son of such a father, and was pleased with this discourse, and said, that he was not worthy to be born at first, if he should reject the determination of God and of his father, and should not resign himself up readily to both their pleasures, since it would have been unjust if he had not obeyed, even if his father alone had so resolved. So he went immediately to the altar to be sacrificed.
And the deed had been done if God had not opposed it.
For he called loudly to Abraham by his name, and forbade him to slay his son, and said, It was not out of a desire of human blood, that he was commanded to slay his son, nor was he willing that he should be taken away from him whom he had made his father, but to try the temper of his mind, whether he would be obedient to such a command. Since therefore he now was satisfied as to that his alacrity, and the surprising readiness he showed in this his piety, he was delighted in having bestowed such blessings upon him, and that he would not be wanting in all sort of concern about him, and in bestowing other children upon him, and that his son should live to a very great age, that he should live in happy life, and bequeath a large principality to his children, who should be good and legitimate. He foretold also that his family should increase into many nations, and that those patriarchs should leave behind them an everlasting name, that they should obtain the possession of the land of Canaan, and be envied by all men.
When God had said this, he produced to them a ram, which did not appear before, for the sacrifice.
So Abraham and Isaac, receiving each other unexpectedly, and having obtained the promises of such great blessings, embraced one another, and when they had sacrificed, they returned to Sarah and lived happily together,
God affording them his assistance in all things they desired. Chapter 14. Concerning Sarah, Abraham's wife, and how she ended her days. 1. Now Sarah died a little while after, having lived 127 years. They buried her in Hebron, the Canaanites publicly allowing them a burying place. Which piece of ground Abraham bought for 400 shekels, of Ephron an inhabitant of Hebron. And both Abraham and his descendants built themselves sepulchres in that place. Chapter 15. How the nation of the troglodytes were derived from Abraham by Keturah. 1. Abraham after this married Keturah, by whom 6 sons were born to him, men of courage and of sagacious minds. Zambran, and Jazar, and Madan, and Madian, and Josabach, and Suz. Now the sons of Suz were Sabbathan, and Dadan. The sons of Dadan were Letusam, and Asser, and Luam.
The sons of Madian were Ephaz, and Ephran, and Enoch, and Ebidas, and Eldas.
Now for all these sons and grandsons, Abraham contrived to settle them in colonies, and they took possession of Troglodytes, and the country of Arabia the Happy, as far as it reaches to the Red Sea. It is related of this Ephraim, that he made war against Libya, and took it, and that his grandchildren, when they inhabited it, called it from his name Africa. And indeed Alexander Polyhistor gives his attestation to what I here say, who speaks thus: Cleodemus the prophet, who was also called Malchus, who wrote an history of the Jews, in agreement with the history of Moses, their legislator, relates, that there were many sons born to Abraham by Keturah. Nay, he names 3 of them, Ephur, and Surim, and Japhran. That from Surim was the land of Assyria denominated, and that from the other 2 Ephur, and Japhran, the country of Africa took its name, because these men were auxiliaries to Hercules, when he fought against Libya and Antaeus. And that Hercules married Aphra's daughter, and of her he begat a son Didoras. And that Sophon was his son, from whom that barbarous people called Sophacians were denominated.